Every night for 30 years, he walked out from behind that curtain and made America feel like everything was going to be fine. He was charming and quick and warm, the most trusted face on American television, the man you ended the day with. He seemed, to the millions of people who watched him, like someone who had figured everything out. But there was a version of Johnny Carson that the cameras never caught, a version that his four wives knew well, that they describe in interviews and in the detailed accounts of the biography published after his death, with words like scared and rampage and two different people. He married 4 times. 4 women said yes to this man the whole world loved. Each of them eventually walked away. The story of why tells you something about Johnny Carson that 30 years of The Tonight Show never did. Norfolk, Nebraska, and the man who was always performing. Before the marriages, before The Tonight Show, before any of it, there was the boy in Nebraska. John William Carson was born on October 23, 1925, in Corning, Iowa, the second of 3 children of Homer. Kit Carson and Ruth Hook Carson. His father worked for a power company. Stable work, practical work, the kind of work that middle American families of the 1930s built their modest lives around. When Johnny was 8, the family moved to Norfolk, Nebraska, and it was in Norfolk, in the specific atmosphere of that small prairie city, with its churches and its local businesses and its culture of practicality and restraint, that the essential shape of who he would become was formed. The Great Plains culture of the 1930s and 1940s was not a culture that encouraged emotional expression. The men of that world were not men who said what they felt or examined what drove them. They worked, they provided, they maintained. The specific emotional reticence that became Johnny Carson's most defining personal characteristic, the wall behind the charm, the privacy behind the warmth, the fundamental inaccessibility behind the apparent openness, was not simply his nature. It was the air he breathed growing up. He was performing magic tricks for neighbors at 14, having taught himself from an instruction book and discovering immediately the specific pleasure of holding a room's attention, of knowing that the people watching were responding to what he chose to do. He was doing a local radio program in Norfolk at 17, already demonstrating the instinct for an audience that would define the next 6 decades of his life. He was, even as a teenager, considerably better at addressing a room than he was at sitting quietly with the person closest to him. The distance between the public performance and the private connection was built into him early, and it would structure everything that followed. He served in the United States Navy toward the end of World War II aboard the USS Pennsylvania in the Pacific, and returned to the University of Nebraska after the service to complete his degree in radio and speech. He graduated in 1949. He was 23 years old and already entirely oriented toward the career he was going to build. There was never a period of uncertainty about what he was going to do with his life. The question was only how quickly he was going to do it. It was at Nebraska, in those years, that he met the woman he would marry first. Her name was Joan Marill Walcott, and everyone called her Jodie. Jodie Walcott, the first wife and the first pattern. Jodie Marill Walcott was a student at the University of Nebraska when she met Johnny Carson, and by all accounts she was a woman of real energy and personality, someone whose vivacity matched Carson's in a way that made the attraction immediate and the early relationship genuinely exciting. They were both young, both talented, both operating in the specific world of post-war American optimism that believed the future was large and available to anyone who reached for it hard enough. They married in October 1949 in North Platte, Nebraska, the year Johnny graduated. He had already landed a job as a radio announcer at WOW in Omaha, and the career was clearly heading somewhere specific. The marriage began with the specific momentum of two young people who believed in each other's potential and who had not yet discovered what the potential would cost. The early years required the family to move repeatedly as Carson's career advanced, from Omaha radio to Los Angeles television in 1951, where he got a local television comedy show and began to develop the specific comedic and interview skills that would eventually make him national. Then to the national stage of Who Do You Trust?, the daytime game show that he hosted from 1957 to 1962, and that established him as a nationally recognized television personality. 3 sons arrived across the early years of the marriage: Christopher in 1950, Richard in 1952, and Corey in 1953. By the time Corey was born, Johnny and Jodie had been married 4 years and were already navigating the specific pressures of a career that was consuming an increasing share of what the marriage needed. Jodie was managing 3 young boys and the household, while Johnny was working the demanding schedule of a rising television personality. The moves were her problem as much as his. The disruptions to any settled domestic life were hers to manage. The specific inequality of that arrangement, his career always the primary consideration, her needs always the secondary one, was not unusual for the era, but it created the specific resentments that the era's expectations didn't provide much space to address. What the biography Carson the Magnificent, written by Bill Zamey and completed by Mike Thomas after Zamey's death in 2023, published in 2024, documents about the marriage to Jodie, is the most candid account yet published of what the private Carson looked like in those years. The picture is not comfortable. Alcohol was at the center of the problem. Carson had a low tolerance for it. He was not a man who became relaxed and genial after a few drinks, the way the social culture of the era expected men to become. He became instead someone else. The anger that the sober Carson managed with the specific control of someone who had learned early that emotions were not for public display came out sideways when he drank, in rages that the people around him found alarming, and that the next morning he would not fully remember. The marriage became a household organized around the specific anxiety of not knowing which version of Carson was going to come home. The sober Carson was warm and funny and capable of genuine tenderness. The drunk Carson came home at 3 in the morning and tore the sheets off the bed while Jodie was sleeping, shouting that he was working his life away while she was doing nothing. Jodie was not simply a passive figure in the dynamic. The biography describes a marriage where both parties acted out, where she would flirt with other men at parties in ways designed to provoke him, where the drinking and the provocations and the explosions formed a cycle that neither of them was able or willing to break. There were infidelities on both sides. There were scenes in front of other couples that left the witnesses deeply uncomfortable. The 2024 biography describes boozy rows, aplenty, and long silent periods of resentment and shame, each party capable of making things worse in their own specific ways. Carson's own account of his relationship with alcohol, offered candidly in a 1979 60 Minutes interview with Mike Wallace, described discovering that he simply did not drink well. That while other people became happy and sociable and affectionate when they drank, he did exactly the opposite. The change happened, he said, before he could stop it. The self-knowledge was real. The behavior change that the self-knowledge was supposed to produce did not come until much later. They divorced in 1963, after 14 years and 3 children. Carson was 37 years old and was about to become the most powerful man in American entertainment. And in the same year the divorce was finalized, he married someone new. Joanne Copeland, the second wife and the show that ate everything. Joanne Copeland was working as a stewardess for Pan American World Airways when she and Carson had their first date in 1960. She was, by the accounts of people who knew the couple, a striking and intelligent woman who had built her own life and career before meeting Carson. Someone who brought a quality of glamour and self-possession to his world at a moment when the specific social world of a rising television personality required exactly that kind of partner. She was also, as it turned out, someone who understood the entertainment industry in ways that made her a genuine professional partner as well as a wife. When Johnny Carson was offered the job of hosting The Tonight Show in 1962, after Jack Parr's departure, the decision was not obvious. The role was enormous. The expectations were enormous. The potential for failure, taking over from a beloved and distinctive predecessor, doing so under the scrutiny of the entire television industry, was equally enormous. Some people around Carson advised caution. Joanne encouraged him directly and specifically to take it. She told him it was the right opportunity and the right time, and that he should accept. He did. They married on August 17th, 1963, in a ceremony that was essentially a surprise. There was no advance announcement, and the news reached the press only after the wedding had taken place. It was the same year his divorce from Jodie was finalized. He had replicated the timing of the first marriage's beginning, which had also coincided with the urgency of a career moment. Married just before or just after a major professional transition, the personal and professional woven together in ways that left very little space between them. The first years of the marriage were years of extraordinary professional success and private difficulty. The Tonight Show was running from NBC's studios in New York, and Carson's preparation for it consumed enormous amounts of his time and energy. 5 nights a week, the performance required everything he had. The research required hours of reading before each taping. The social obligations that the show generated, the industry relationships that needed maintaining, the talent that needed cultivating, consumed hours more. And what was left for the marriage was not always sufficient. The drinking pattern from the first marriage had not changed. Joanne Copeland's account of what it looked like from the inside is one of the most direct and specific descriptions of Carson's private behavior that any of his wives provided. She described the experience of living with 2 completely different people: the sober Carson, who was warm and funny and engaged, and the drunk Carson, who became a tiger. He had a low tolerance, she told the biographer. He had blackouts. He would come home in the early hours after whatever had happened after the taping and pull the sheets off the bed while she was sleeping, furious that he was working his life away while she slept. The anger had a quality that she named directly. He had a tremendous anger about women that would come out when he was drinking. Not a specific anger at her, a general anger at women as a category, that the sober Carson contained effectively, and that the drunk Carson could not. She could not explain where it came from. She was not in a position to explain it. She could only describe what it looked like from where she was standing. He would be remorseful the following day, remorseful and embarrassed, and genuinely sorry, by all accounts. And then the cycle would begin again, because the remorse, however genuine, was not the same as change. The marriage lasted 9 years, ending in divorce in 1972. The settlement that the court ordered was $6,000 per month in alimony, to continue until Joanne remarried or until Carson died. Neither condition was met while the other was available. She never remarried. Carson died in 2005. She collected that monthly payment for 33 years after the divorce, an arrangement that outlasted all his subsequent marriages and became, in its way, the longest relationship he had with any of the 4 women. The same year the second divorce was finalized, Carson married someone new again. Joanna Holland, the third wife and the most expensive divorce. Joanna Holland was a model when she met Johnny Carson in 1971 at the 21 Club in New York, the famous Manhattan restaurant that was, in the early 1970s, one of the central social gathering places of the world that The Tonight Show occupied. He recalled later, in a People magazine interview, that he was openly flirting with her when they first encountered each other, and that the attraction was immediate and mutual. She was striking and self-possessed, a woman who had built her own life before she encountered Carson, and who had a son, Joe Holland, from a previous relationship. The family they formed together included Joe, whose presence in the household was one of the more uncomplicated dimensions of what turned out to be a deeply complicated marriage. They married in 1972, the same year Carson's divorce from Joanne Copeland was finalized. The pattern that had defined his approach to romantic transitions was holding firm. The new relationship began before the old one had fully resolved. The new marriage was in place before the wound of the previous one could close, and the specific urgency of the career transition. The Tonight Show was moving from New York to Los Angeles in 1972, which was an enormous practical disruption as well as a professional relocation, was running simultaneously with the personal one. The early years of the marriage were spent navigating the move to California, the establishment of a new domestic life in a new city, and the continuing demands of the show. They lived well. A house in Bel Air, the social world of Los Angeles in the 1970s. The specific glamour of being the wife of the most powerful man in American entertainment. Joanna was photographed at the right events, in the right clothes, and was, by all accounts, genuinely beautiful in the specific way of someone who had built a modeling career on her appearance, and who had not let that appearance slide. But the drinking pattern was still present. Joanna's account, documented in the 2024 biography and in her earlier interview with Mike Wallace for 60 Minutes, describes the same fundamental dynamic that both Jodie and Joanne had described before her. The experience of going out with one person and coming home with someone whose temperament was completely different. She described those black drunk episodes as frightening. She described the unpredictability of whatever could set him off. She used the word scared. In 1982, Carson was arrested for driving over the legal limit. He pled no contest to a misdemeanor charge. He was fined $603 and placed on 3 years of probation. The arrest became public news, as it inevitably would given who he was, and the gap between the trusted, controlled public image and the private reality was briefly and uncomfortably visible. The marriage had already been deteriorating for years by the time the divorce was finalized in 1985. Joanna initially requested $220,000 per month in alimony. The final settlement she received included $35,000 monthly plus $2 million in cash, multiple luxury cars, the Bel Air house, a New York apartment, and a Picasso painting. A total value reported at over $20 million. It was, and was widely described as, one of the most significant celebrity divorce settlements of its era. Joanna used the resources the settlement provided to reinvent herself. She became a Broadway producer, moved into philanthropic work, and built a professional life outside the shadow of the marriage. She was not, in other words, defined permanently by having been Johnny Carson's third wife. She found her own path. She died in July 2025 at an advanced age, having outlived her famous ex-husband by 2 decades. The pattern that 3 wives named. 3 marriages, 3 divorces. 3 women who had lived inside the specific private reality of Johnny Carson and who, when eventually given the opportunity to describe what they had found there, described versions of the same thing. The drinking was the headline, but the drinking was not quite the whole story. The drinking was the mechanism through which something deeper expressed itself, an anger that Carson himself acknowledged having, an anger specifically directed at women that the sober and controlled version of himself managed effectively and that the drunk version could not contain. Where the anger came from is something no one has definitively answered. The 2024 biography does not provide a tidy psychological explanation for it. The culture Carson grew up in did not encourage the kind of self-examination that might have produced an explanation. He managed it, rather than understood it, for most of his life. And the management worked until the alcohol turned the management off. Joanne Copeland named it most directly a tremendous anger about women. Not about her specifically, about the category. Whatever had produced that anger in the boy from Norfolk, Nebraska, the specific configuration of his family, the specific culture of emotional repression he had grown up in, the specific dynamics of the first marriage, it was present in the second marriage and the third marriage with a consistency that rules out the possibility that it was simply situational. What is most revealing about the pattern is not the divorce itself, but the repetition. The same underlying dynamic expressing itself in 3 consecutive marriages with the same basic structure: the initial attraction and genuine warmth, the escalating drinking-related episodes, the moments of genuine fear described by women who were not prone to exaggeration, and eventually the ending. The biographies and interviews across the decades describe women who came in believing they had found the warm, funny, trusted public Carson, and who discovered, at varying speeds, that there was considerably more to what they had taken on than the screen had prepared them for. Carson addressed it himself, in the most honest terms he used about his marriages. In the observation he offered to People magazine that if he had given as much to marriage as he gave to The Tonight Show, he probably would have had a hell of a marriage. It is a statement that is both honest and incomplete. The show was competing with the marriages for his time and attention, genuinely. But something else was competing with the marriages, too. The specific emotional unavailability of a man who was constitutionally more comfortable in front of an audience than in a kitchen, more comfortable delivering a performance than sustaining a relationship. The show gave him the structure in which his most available and most functional self could operate. The marriages required a different kind of availability that he had not learned to provide, and did not learn to provide until the 4th one. He stopped drinking significantly at some point before the 4th marriage. The specific timing is not publicly documented with precision, but the 4th marriage's absence of the pattern that defined the first 3 is consistent with someone who had made a fundamental change. He also, by 1987, had been through enough to understand something about what the marriages had cost and what had caused the costs. Whether he sought formal treatment or simply arrived at the change through the specific accumulation of consequences, the result was visible. Alexis Maas lived with a different version of Johnny Carson than Jodie Walcott, Joanne Copeland, or Joanna Holland had lived with. The tragedy of the first 3 marriages is not simply that they ended. It is that they ended for a specific and addressable reason that Carson was not able to address until his 60s. 3 women experienced the consequences of a problem that he eventually solved. They had already left by then. What Carson finally figured out, not just about the drinking, but about the specific relationship between his public self and his private one, between the warmth he gave to millions and the warmth he struggled to give to the woman in the same house, is not something he ever fully documented. He was not a man who invited that kind of examination of himself. The memoir was never written. The confessional interview was never given. He retreated from public life in 1992 and stayed retreated until his death in 2005. And the interior of those 13 years was genuinely private in the way that almost nothing else in his public life had been. But the 4th marriage is the evidence. Alexis Maas chose him at 61 and stayed until his death at 79. She did not leave. Whatever the first three wives found and could not stay with, she found something different, or found the same man at a different moment in his life, when the defences had lowered enough and the career was no longer consuming everything, and the specific angry volatility of the drinking years had been set aside. She found a version of Johnny Carson that the first three wives, in the specific timing of their marriages, did not quite get to know. The line about The Tonight Show was honest, as far as it went. But the last word on the marriages belongs to the one that lasted. Alexis Maas stayed. Everything else that needed to be said is in that fact. Alexis Maas, the fourth wife and the one who stayed. Alexis Maas was 29 years old when she met Johnny Carson in 1987. He was 61. The age gap, more than 30 years, was immediately noted and frequently commented upon in the way that such gaps always are, with the specific shorthand that the culture uses to suggest that what is happening is not quite a real relationship. But the people who knew the couple in those years have consistently described the marriage as something more substantive than the cynical narrative invited. She was a former model who had been living in Florida before they met. The circumstances of their introduction were not elaborately documented, which is consistent with the general privacy that characterized the entire fourth marriage. What was documented by the people who observed it from outside and by Carson's own rare public comments was what the marriage produced: a quieter, more genuinely settled version of Johnny Carson than any of the three previous marriages had managed to generate. Something was different in this marriage. This is the observation that emerges from every account of it, from every person who knew Carson in those years and compared the man in the fourth marriage to the man they had known in the previous three. Producer George Schlatter, who had known Carson for decades and had watched him navigate all four marriages from the vantage point of a close professional friend, described Alexis simply as the real love of Johnny's life. Others who knew them said the same thing in different words, that she was the first of the four women he married with whom he seemed to have figured out something that had eluded him in all the years before. What was different is not entirely easy to explain, because Carson did not explain it publicly, and Alexis has not explained it since. But several things had changed by 1987 that were not true in 1949 or 1963 or 1972. Carson was 61 years old. He had been through 3 marriages and 3 divorces, and had arrived at an age at which the specific urgency and volatility of the career's peak years were beginning to recede. The show that had consumed 30 years of his best energy was approaching its end. He would retire in 1992, 5 years after the fourth marriage began. The alcohol that had driven the most damaging episodes of the first 3 marriages was not the same structural problem in the fourth. He and Alexis lived together in their home in Malibu, in the specific private world of the California coast that was very far from the New York and Burbank studios where the career had been built. He watched tennis. He wrote jokes that he never performed. He kept up with the science and the politics and the cultural life that had always fed the show's preparation, maintaining the habits of a man who was genuinely curious about the world, even after the world no longer had a nightly reason to need his observations about it. He retired from The Tonight Show in May 1992, after 30 years. The final broadcast was extraordinary in the way of things that have been genuinely important for a very long time, and are now ending, emotionally present in ways that the carefully controlled public Carson rarely permitted. A goodbye that was recognized immediately as the conclusion of something irreplaceable. He sat alone at the desk for the last segment, without a guest, and spoke about what the show had meant to him and what the audience had meant to him, and what it was like to say goodbye to something that had been the center of his professional life for 3 decades. After that night, he became private in a way that was unprecedented for someone of his stature. He gave almost no interviews in the 13 years between his retirement and his death. He attended almost no public events. He declined the honors and the tributes and the career retrospectives that his standing could have commanded. He became, in those years, the specific thing that the career had never quite allowed him to be: a man whose public life was genuinely over, who was living the private life that had always competed with the show for what he had available to give. He developed emphysema, the consequence of decades of cigarette smoking that had been a constant throughout his career. The illness was progressive. The decline was gradual, and then not gradual. Alexis was with him through the illness and through the final months and through his death on January 23rd, 2005, at the age of 79, in the Malibu home they had shared for 18 years. She has remained private since. She inherited his estate alongside his sons, Christopher and Corey. She has not written a book. She has not given the extensive interviews that the previous marriages had eventually generated. She has simply maintained the specific privacy that the fourth marriage had always prioritized. The quality of a life that was genuinely and completely her own, shared with a man who had finally, at 61 years old, figured out how to actually share it. What Carson finally said about it all. The line that gets quoted most often when people discuss Johnny Carson's personal life is the one he offered to People magazine, that if he had given as much to his marriages as he gave to The Tonight Show, he probably would have had a hell of a marriage. It is a good line. It is, like most of Carson's best lines, perfectly constructed. Self-deprecating, honest at the surface level, and protecting something deeper beneath the surface. The line implies that the problem was simply one of divided attention, of the career demanding too much of what the marriage needed. This is true, as far as it goes. The show consumed enormous amounts of what the marriages required. The preparation was relentless. The performance was 5 nights a week. The social obligations that accompanied being the most powerful tastemaker in American entertainment were ongoing and demanding. There was never a moment when the show was not making claims on the time and energy and mental presence that a marriage also needs. But the line doesn't quite go far enough. The show was not the only thing competing with the marriages. The anger was competing with the marriages. The drinking was competing with the marriages. The specific emotional wall that the Great Plains upbringing and the career of public performance had together built around his interior life was competing with the marriages in ways that the line about The Tonight Show does not acknowledge. What the line does is redirect the accounting toward the career, which is the safest place to put it, because the career is something external, something that happened to him, something the industry demanded, something that the world required of him. The drinking and the anger are something internal, something that the line sidesteps with the specific skill of a man who spent his professional life knowing exactly where the line between disclosure and deflection was, and who was very, very good at staying on the right side of it. Carson was not a bad man. The people who knew him longest and best did not describe someone who was malicious or who set out to cause the harm he caused. They described someone who was genuinely warm in the ways the screen showed, and who had genuine difficulty translating that warmth into the consistent, daily, vulnerable intimacy that a marriage requires. The warmth he gave to the audience every night was real. The warmth he struggled to give to the women who shared his life was also real, or at least the intention behind it was. Both things were simultaneously true. Henry Bushkin, Carson's lawyer and close friend for many years, who eventually wrote his own memoir about their relationship, described Carson as someone who was fundamentally alone in a way that was difficult to fully explain. who had built the specific kind of inner isolation that allows a person to be charming and engaging in public while being genuinely difficult to reach in private. Pushkin watched him from closer in than almost anyone else for 20 years and arrived at the conclusion that the emotional wall was not a pose. It was structural. It was the real thing. 3 wives experienced that wall from the inside, and eventually all 3 stopped trying to get through it. The 4th wife arrived when the wall, for whatever combination of age and experience and decision, had come down enough for something genuinely different to be possible. He once said, in a moment of characteristic self-awareness, that he had grown up in a part of the country where you were not supposed to wear your heart on your sleeve, where the expression of feeling was considered a form of weakness, and where the management of your interior life was the price of fitting in. He never stopped paying that price. For 60 years, it was the price of being Johnny Carson, and neither did the women who loved him. The legacy they left behind. The 4 women who married Johnny Carson were each, in their own way, shaped permanently by the experience of a relationship with one of the most public and most private men of the 20th century. Jodie Walcott outlived him by many years. She was still living as of this writing, one of the few surviving people who knew the private Carson of the early career years, the man before the fame had fully arrived and the control had fully set. She has maintained the privacy that all the Carson children also maintained. The marriage lasted 14 years and produced 3 sons. It also produced a specific template: a woman managing the household and the children and the moves, while the career was always the primary consideration, that the second and third wives would recognize when they read about it. Joanne Copeland collected her $6,000 monthly alimony for 33 years, from the 1972 divorce until Carson's death in 2005. It was, in its way, the longest continuous financial relationship any of the 4 marriages had produced, a monthly reminder for 3 decades of what the second marriage had been worth in the specific terms that legal settlements apply to human experience. She eventually built her own life, her own private trajectory, away from the world the second marriage had occupied. She was, by the accounts available, not bitter about it. She had described what she experienced with honesty and without embellishment. She had received what the court determined she was owed. She moved forward. The fact that she never remarried, whether by choice or by circumstance, is simply a fact, not a commentary on the marriage that preceded it. Joanna Holland became a Broadway producer and philanthropist after receiving the settlement that became one of the most discussed celebrity divorces of the 1980s. The model, who had met Carson at the 21 Club in 1971, became, in the years after the settlement, someone who used the resources and the freedom it provided to build something of genuine cultural and artistic value. She was not simply the woman who had been married to Johnny Carson. She died in July 2025, having outlived her famous ex-husband by 20 years, having built a life that was her own. Alexis Maas has remained private. She was at his side at the end, through the illness and through the death, in the Malibu home they had shared. She has not written a book. She has not given the extensive interviews that the stories of the previous marriages eventually generated. She has simply been the person who was there, which may be the most honest description of what the 4th and final marriage was. Johnny Carson died on January 23, 2005. The tributes were immediate and enormous. He had been, as those tributes consistently noted, irreplaceable. The specific combination of intelligence and wit and warmth and timing that he had brought to The Tonight Show for 30 years had not been replicated by anyone who followed him. It is unlikely to be. He had also been, as the people who shared his private life consistently noted, genuinely difficult to know. The wall between the public man and the private one was real, and it was high, and it had cost 4 marriages, and whatever the marriages had cost the 4 women inside them. 3 of those women found the wall too high to sustain a life on the other side of. The 4th arrived when the wall had finally, in some essential way, come down enough for something more genuine to take root. He once said that he had grown up in a part of the country where you were not supposed to wear your heart on your sleeve, where the expression of feeling was considered a form of weakness, and where learning to manage your interior life was the price of belonging. He said this with the characteristic lightness that he brought to everything that was actually serious about himself, the deflection wrapped in self-awareness, the acknowledgement that didn't quite become an explanation. He knew what the culture had done to him. He could name it. He could not, in 3 marriages, fully undo it. He never stopped paying that price. For 60 years, it was the price of being Johnny Carson, the price of the warmth the whole world received, the warmth that required the performance that required the distance. And neither did the women who loved him. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.